In the harsh, untamed wilderness of northern Minnesota, the wind whispered through towering pines, carrying ancient secrets woven into the fabric of the forest. At just 7 years old, Sarah's world was torn apart by unimaginable loss. But she remembered the survival lessons her grandfather had passed down. Stay silent when danger is near, trust your instincts, and above all, understand that the forest provides for those who know how to listen. When 3 armed strangers storm their secluded cabin, hunting for something hidden and willing to kill to find it, Sarah finds herself thrust into a nightmare no child should face. She hides in a secret crawl space beneath the floorboards, clutching a hand-carved wooden figure of a Canada lynx, her grandfather's final gift. Her hands tremble as chaos erupts above her. But what the intruders don't know is that Sarah is not alone. Luna, a wild Canada lynx with golden eyes and a coat dappled like winter shadows, prowls the woods nearby. Silent, watchful, and ready. They thought she was just a child. They didn't realize the wilderness was alive, and it was prepared to defend its own. Before we start, make sure to subscribe if you haven't and hit the like button. Also hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The northern Minnesota wilderness stretched vast and unforgiving beneath a heavy February sky. 7-year-old Sarah Reynolds pressed her small body deeper into the hidden crawl space beneath the wooden floorboards, her breath forming tiny clouds in the frigid air. Boots pounded across the cabin floor above her, sending dust sifting down through the cracks onto her pale, upturned face. "Find the kid," a harsh voice barked. Dawson said the old man mentioned a granddaughter. "She has to be here somewhere." Sarah's heart thudded wildly against her ribs. She could still hear her grandfather's final urgent whisper as he pushed her toward the concealed door beneath the pantry floor. "Remember what I taught you, little bird. Stay hidden until it's safe, no matter what you hear." Then came the terrible sounds. Thuds, crashes, a struggle, and then silence. Her grandfather's voice was gone. Now, strangers were tearing the cabin apart, searching for her. Clutching the small, carved wooden Canada lynx her grandfather had given her for her last birthday, Sarah held her breath. The toy's smooth surface had been worn by countless touches, its familiar feel a small comfort in the darkness. A single tear traced a path through the dirt, smudging her cheek, but she made no sound. Grandpa Jack had taught her well, in the wilderness, silence meant survival. What the intruders didn't know, what even Sarah couldn't fully grasp, was that human footsteps weren't the only ones moving through the cabin now. A low growl, barely audible, rumbled through the floorboards. Luna had returned from her morning hunt. Sarah Reynolds hadn't always lived in a remote cabin tucked deep within Minnesota's North Woods. Once, she'd had a sunny yellow bedroom in Minneapolis, parents who kissed her goodnight, and a school where she'd just begun to learn to read. That life had ended abruptly one snowy December evening, when an icy highway and a jackknifed semi-truck took both her parents from her. With no other immediate family willing to take her in, Sarah had been sent to live with her maternal grandfather, Jack Reynolds, known to the locals as the Hermit of Basswood County. 15 years earlier, Jack had retreated into the wilderness after his wife's death, building a self-sufficient life nearly 40 miles from the nearest town. At first, social services had been reluctant to place a traumatized 5-year-old in such remote isolation with a 70-year-old man. But Jack had fought fiercely for custody, making rare trips into town to meet with officials and promising to bring Sarah in regularly for schooling assessments and medical checkups. "The wilderness will heal her," he'd insisted. "It healed me when I had nothing left." Sarah had arrived at the cabin nude with grief, a tiny, ghost-like child who flinched at every touch and stared vacantly at the towering pines surrounding her new home. Jack, despite his gruff demeanor, showed unexpected patience. He never forced her to speak. Instead, he quietly included her in his routines, checking trap lines, identifying animal tracks, splitting wood, preserving food. "The forest provides everything we need," he told her one night, though she rarely replied. "You just have to learn its language." Slowly, over the weeks that stretched into months, Sarah began to emerge from the cocoon of her sorrow. The first days were hard, marked by deep silences that Jack would not dare disturb. The sorrow Sarah carried within her was like a heavy cloak, weighing her down and separating her from the world. She had withdrawn so deeply into herself after the trauma, becoming a shadow of the child Jack had once known. But, slowly, day by day, she started to heal, and Jack was patient with her every step of the way. She started with small tasks, sorting pine nuts, stacking kindling. Every task, no matter how small, seemed to bring her back to the present moment. It was as if each small chore helped her begin to rebuild her life, piece by piece. Sarah's small hands, once trembling, now moved with a quiet purpose. The cabin, though isolated, was a safe haven for Sarah. The quiet hum of life in the wilderness soothed her, and the rhythmic sounds of nature became familiar and comforting. Her first spoken words in months came one crisp morning when she gently corrected Jack after he misidentified a bird call. "That's not a chickadee," she said softly. "It's a nuthatch." Jack turned to her, his weathered face breaking into a surprised smile, eyes suddenly moist. "You're right, little bird. Good ears." There was something miraculous about that moment. The return of Sarah's voice, her spirit coming back to life in the most unexpected way. By the time Sarah turned 6, she had adapted to life in the wilderness with the quiet resilience only children possess. She could read the sky, move silently through the trees, and understood the respectful distance owed to wild creatures. The world around her seemed to become her classroom, and the lessons were drawn from nature itself. The cabin had no electricity, no running water, and certainly no internet, but it held walls lined with books that Jack had collected over decades. Sarah devoured them by lantern light, her curiosity burning brightly. During their monthly trips into town, the locals marveled at her transformation. The hollow-eyed, silent child had become quick and observant, her sun-streaked hair perpetually wind-tangled and her knees constantly scraped from climbing trees. Dr. Cooper, the aging town physician who monitored Jack's heart condition, declared her as healthy as a young bear cub, despite the unconventional upbringing. Jack was pleased to hear it, but the words weren't the part that mattered. It was the spark in Sarah's eyes, the life that was returning, that reassured him most. Not everyone was so easily convinced, though. Marjorie Dawson, the county's child welfare officer, visited the cabin every 3 months. Her lips were perpetually pursed with disapproval as she documented the lack of modern amenities and socialization. She should be in school with other children, Marjorie insisted at each visit. This isolation isn't natural. Nothing about losing your parents at 5 is natural, Jack would reply calmly, though his eyes were flinty. She's learning what she needs to survive. What Jack never mentioned to the officials was how deep Sarah's trauma still ran. Despite her growth and outward confidence, nightmares continued to plague her, sending her scrambling into Jack's room at night, shaking with remembered fear. On the worst nights, they would wrap themselves in quilts and sit on the cabin porch, tracing constellations in the sky until her breathing steadied. The stars above them seemed so distant, yet somehow present, as if watching over them. Despite the cold that seeped into their bones, the comfort they found in each other, in the silence of the night, was enough to bring Sarah peace. But she still struggled with those dark memories, and Jack didn't push her to talk about it unless she was ready. He had seen enough pain in his life to know that some wounds take longer to heal than others. It was during one such night, beneath a canopy of frozen stars in the harshest winter in decades, that Luna entered their lives. The cold was biting, and the snow had settled in thick layers over the land. The howl of the wind was the only sound that filled the night, the kind of cold that seemed to penetrate even the sturdiest of buildings. Sarah and Jack had wrapped themselves in quilts as they sat on the porch, staring at the vast, starry sky. The air was still and quiet when Sarah's gaze shifted to the edge of the forest. There, in the distance, stood Luna, her fur glowing faintly in the moonlight. The lynx had appeared like a dream, like a shadow that stepped out of the forest itself. At first, Jack thought it was another wild animal, but then he saw Luna's distinctive markings, the same lynx who had been at the cabin months before. "Sarah, look," Jack said, his voice soft but filled with awe. Sarah turned, her eyes wide, and for the first time in a long while, her lips curled into a tentative smile. Luna approached slowly, her golden eyes fixed on Sarah. The lynx seemed unafraid, as if she had come to offer comfort, to bring some kind of healing to the wounds that Sarah still carried. As Luna drew closer, Sarah rose to her feet, her breath visible in the cold night air. Luna sat down in front of her, just beyond reach, her body still and calm. Sarah hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward, her small hand reaching out tentatively. The lynx didn't flinch or retreat. Instead, she met Sarah's touch with an almost knowing gaze. It was a moment of connection, of understanding that surpassed words. Luna had returned, and with her, something ancient and healing filled the air. Jack watched, his heart filled with a deep sense of gratitude. The wilderness, with all its harshness and beauty, had brought Luna back to them, and with her, a reminder that even in the coldest, darkest moments, there was always hope for renewal. The next morning, as Sarah gently stroked Luna's spotted head, the lynx purred, a deep, unsettling sound coming from a creature that should have retained its wild wariness. "Sarah," Jack said cautiously, watching the pair, "Luna's not a house cat. No matter how tame she seems, she's still a wild animal, with instincts we'll never fully understand." Sarah's expression turned serious. "She understands more than people think," she said. "She's my friend." Jack worried that Sarah's attachment to the Canada lynx was growing into something unhealthy, another manifestation of her trauma. And yet, since Luna's arrival, the nightmares had become far less frequent. Sarah smiled more, spoke more, and seemed truly present in a way she hadn't been since the accident. The change was undeniable. During Marjorie Dawson's next quarterly visit, they kept Luna out of sight in the farthest enclosure. Still, Jack never figured out how the caseworker discovered Luna's existence. "This is beyond irresponsible," Marjorie snapped, her face flushed with anger. "It's dangerous and illegal to keep a wild predator, especially around a child." "Luna would never hurt me," Sarah interrupted, her small fists clenched. "She's family." The word family sent a chill down Jack's spine. He'd seen how Luna anticipated Sarah's needs, how the two seemed to communicate through subtle glances and body language. It wasn't natural, but it wasn't threatening either. If anything, Luna had taken it upon herself to act as Sarah's protector. The revelation triggered increased scrutiny. Marjorie filed formal reports questioning Jack's suitability as a guardian, citing unsafe living conditions and the presence of a wild animal. Wildlife officials made a visit to the cabin, but Sheriff Ellis, a former hunting buddy of Jack's who understood his situation, had given him a warning ahead of time. "They'll confiscate the cat," Ellis said over the crackling phone line, "and likely put it down. And Jack, if they push hard enough, they might review Sarah's placement too." Jack crafted a believable story about releasing the lynx months earlier and hid Luna deep in the forest during the inspection. The officials left seemingly satisfied, but Marjorie remained suspicious, increasing the frequency and intensity of her visits. It was during this period of heightened tension that Jack's nephew, Michael, appeared at the cabin, for the first time in over a decade. He wasn't alone. With him came a sharply dressed man named Eric Daniels, introduced as his business partner. Their arrival in a mud-splattered SUV immediately put Jack on edge. "Uncle Jack." Michael greeted him with forced cheer. "Look at you, playing wilderness grandpa. And this must be little Sarah." Sarah, who had been teaching Luna to respond to bird calls in the clearing behind the cabin, watched the strangers with quiet suspicion. "What brings you all the way out here, Michael?" Jack asked, his voice cool. "Last I heard, you were living in Chicago." "Real estate development," Michael replied casually, while Eric wandered around the property, appearing to assess the land and structure. "Actually, that's partly why we're here. This region is drawing attention. People looking for authentic wilderness experiences without giving up modern comforts." Jack's expression darkened. "This land's not for sale." "Of course not," Michael said with a laugh, though his eyes remained sharp and calculating. "We're just asking questions about some mineral rights. Seems there might be valuable deposits nearby. We'd love to take a look at your deed, clarify a few boundary issues." The conversation quickly turned tense, until Sarah deliberately knocked over a lantern, creating a sudden distraction. The visit ended prematurely, but not without warning. After they left, Jack sat heavily in his chair, his face grim. "I don't trust them," Sarah said, voicing exactly what Jack was thinking. He nodded slowly. "Michael's father, my brother, always had his eye on this land. Those old mineral surveys hinted at valuable deposits. I thought that interest died with him." That night, Jack drove into town alone to speak with Sheriff Ellis and to check the safe deposit box that held his property documents. What he learned disturbed him deeply. Someone had been making inquiries about his land. Even worse, there were reports of claim jumpers operating in the county, intimidating elderly landowners to force them off valuable parcels. When Jack returned the next day, He immediately reactivated the security protocols he hadn't used since his military days. He showed Sarah hiding places, escape routes, and taught her emergency signals. "If anything happens to me," he told her with rare seriousness, "take the emergency pack. Follow the creek north for 2 miles. Then cut east to the Andersons' place. Don't trust anyone but Sheriff Ellis." Sarah nodded solemnly, sensing the gravity of the situation. That night, Luna refused to return to her enclosure. Instead, she prowled the perimeter of the cabin like a silent sentinel. 3 days later, the intruders came. Now, crouched beneath the floorboards in the hidden crawlspace, Sarah listened as the men tore the cabin apart above her. "The old man's not talking," one voice said. Dawson swore he had documentation, original mineral surveys. "They've got to be here." "Forget the papers," another replied. "If we don't find them, we make sure no one's left to contest the claim." "Clean job. Make it look like the old man had an accident." Sarah bit her lip to keep from crying out. Grandpa Jack was hurt. Maybe worse. Her fingers tightened around the carved wooden links. Footsteps creaked closer to the pantry. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream split the air, followed by a crash, and then a gunshot. Above the chaos, Sarah heard a sound she recognized instantly. Luna's battle cry. She'd only heard it once before, when a wolf had come too close to the cabin. "What the hell is that?" someone shouted. "Shoot it." Another gunshot. Glass shattered. Men cursed. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Luna was fighting. Fighting for Jack, for their home. Despite everything Grandpa had taught her about staying hidden, she couldn't let Luna face this alone. With trembling hands, she pushed open the concealed door and peered into the cabin. The scene was chaos. Luna, bristling and bloodied, stood protectively between an unconscious Jack and 2 armed men. One intruder was already down, clutching a mangled, bleeding arm. The other raised his gun, aiming at the snarling lynx. "Luna!" Sarah screamed. The sound distracted the man just long enough for Luna to leap at his weapon arm. What happened next would later be dismissed by officials as the exaggerated memory of a traumatized child, but Sarah knew what she saw. As Luna battled the intruder, a strange sound came from her throat, deeper, more primal than any lynx call Sarah had heard. From the forest beyond the shattered cabin window, other calls echoed in response. The first shadow appeared in the broken window frame, a male Canada lynx, larger than Luna, ears laid flat in aggression. Then another slipped silently through the doorway. A third leapt up onto the kitchen counter. For wild lynx had joined Luna inside the cabin, drawn by her call. The injured intruder scrambled backward in terror. "What the hell, Ritter? We've got to get out of here." The man wrestling with Luna kicked her away and fired wildly as the others closed in. But the lynxes moved with an eerie coordination, herding the men away from Jack and toward the cabin door. Sarah rushed to her grandfather's side. A deep gash on his temple oozed blood, but his chest rose and fell. He was alive. Relief flooded her as she pressed her small hand to the wound. Outside, the men's panic echoed through the forest, competing with the low growls of the lynx pack. Luna returned to Sarah's side, panting, her coat streaked with blood. Whether her own or the intruders', Sarah couldn't tell. "Luna," she whispered, pointing toward the rifle mounted above the fireplace, the one Jack had taught her to use in emergencies. Luna seemed to understand. With a graceful leap, she knocked it down into Sarah's waiting hands. Her fingers steady despite her fear, Sarah loaded the rifle and stepped onto the porch. In the yard, the lynxes had surrounded the intruders. The men stood back to back, one still armed, but clearly recognizing their defeat. "Don't move," Sarah commanded, raising the rifle. "Luna's family doesn't like you, and neither do I." The man called Ritter swung his pistol toward her voice, but before he could aim, the largest lynx lunged, knocking the weapon from his grip. For several tense minutes, they stood locked in a standoff, the wounded men surrounded by growling predators, and Sarah, rifle in hand, watching their every move. Then came the blessed sound of approaching vehicles. Sheriff Ellis and his deputies, alerted by a passing ranger who'd heard the gunshots. Sarah Reynolds. Ellis called cautiously, taking in the surreal scene. Are you hurt? Where's your grandfather? Grandpa's inside, Sarah replied, still not lowering the rifle. These men hurt him. They were going to kill us and take our land. As though sensing the arrival of help, the wild lynxes began to retreat into the woods, all but Luna, who remained beside Sarah, her body shaking with exertion, her left shoulder soaked with blood. As the deputies worked to secure the intruders, Sheriff Ellis remained in the yard, eyeing the wild lynx with a sense of awe and disbelief. He couldn't fully comprehend what had just happened, how a creature, thought to be untamable and solitary, had not only protected Sarah but had also summoned other lynx to her aid. He hadn't seen anything like it in all his years in the woods. But his focus soon shifted to Sarah, still standing tall with a rifle in her hands, her small frame radiating a quiet strength. He gently took the weapon from her, his weathered hands more gentle than she expected, though his gaze never strayed from the bloodied lynx by her side. Let's get your grandpa some help, Ellis said softly, trying to pull Sarah's attention away from Luna. His eyes were full of concern, not just for Jack, but for Sarah as well. This child had witnessed something no one her age should ever have to experience, yet she remained composed and steady. Ellis' voice cracked slightly, betraying the emotion he'd held in check. He'd known Jack for years. He couldn't imagine the pain his old friend had endured. But Jack had always been a fighter, and Ellis had no doubt he'd pull through. But Sarah's eyes remained locked on Luna. The lynx, though still standing protectively, looked exhausted. Blood matted her fur, and the wound on her shoulder was severe, but it was clear she wasn't going anywhere without Sarah. She saved us, Sarah said, her voice unwavering. She called the others. Ellis' heart sank as he crouched beside the child and the animal. He knew enough to recognize that something extraordinary had occurred, but he also knew that, in this world, the extraordinary didn't always fit into the neat boxes of reason or understanding. He looked down at the lynx. She was unlike anything he'd ever seen, majestic and fierce, yet vulnerable in the way she lay there, trusting the girl at her side. He stroked his hand over his jaw, then sighed, turning to the medics. Inside, the medics were working quickly on Jack, stabilizing him as best as they could. Dr. Cooper, the town's reluctant physician, arrived with the emergency team, but he hesitated when he saw the lynx. His brow furrowed as he observed the creature. He wasn't a veterinarian, and dealing with wildlife injuries wasn't his specialty, but he knew enough to see that Luna's condition was grave. She's lost a lot of blood, Dr. Cooper said, his voice heavy with concern. He approached Luna slowly, his movements deliberate and cautious. But despite the fact that the lynx was injured and weak, she remained calm, allowing him to get close, provided Sarah remained at her side, her hand firmly placed on Luna's shoulder. Sarah's face twisted with worry, her small hands trembling as she stroked Luna's fur. The sharp smell of blood filled the air, and her eyes welled with tears, but she refused to break down. Luna had saved her, saved Jack, and Sarah wouldn't allow her to slip away. You have to save her. Please, Sarah said in a broken voice, her plea urgent and raw. Dr. Cooper looked down at the child, then at Luna, his mind racing. He wasn't a veterinarian, and this was beyond his scope. He had no answers, no promises to offer. But the way Sarah held onto Luna, her unwavering trust in the wild creature, made his heart ache with empathy. The tension in the cabin was palpable. As the medics worked swiftly on Jack, Sarah stayed close to Luna, her hand resting on the lynx's side, offering what little comfort she could. The lynx seemed to appreciate the touch, though her body twitched in pain with every movement. Dr. Cooper, though still uncertain, took a deep breath and addressed the situation. I'll do what I can, he said, a reluctant confidence in his voice. He gestured to the medics to prepare for more focused attention on Luna. I've dealt with injuries before, but this, he trailed off, his gaze lingering on the blood-stained fur of the lynx. His voice softened. She's no ordinary animal. Sarah nodded, her face pale but determined. She's my family, she whispered, as if the words themselves carried an undeniable truth. She didn't need to explain any further. Dr. Cooper understood. There was a bond between them, one that transcended logic and reason. The room fell quiet as the medics worked on Luna. Sarah was aware of the tension in the air, the strain on the adults who were trying to figure out what to do. But she knew only one thing. Luna had kept them safe. She wasn't going to let the lynx die. Minutes stretched into hours, but finally, Dr. Cooper stepped back, wiping his brow. He was exhausted, but there was a flicker of hope in his eyes. "She's stable," he said, his voice gruff but relieved. "The wound's still serious, but I've stopped the bleeding for now. She's tough, she might pull through." A small breath of relief escaped Sarah's lips, but it didn't last long. She remained beside Luna, her hand on her fur, eyes never leaving the lynx's face. Sarah wasn't just a passive observer in this moment. She was Luna's protector, just as Luna had protected her. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, though it was unclear whether she was speaking to Dr. Cooper, to Luna, or to the universe that had somehow brought them together. Dr. Cooper looked from the tear-streaked child to the surprisingly docile wild predator who, according to the panicked confessions of the apprehended intruders, had orchestrated a coordinated attack with other wild Canada lynxes, an unprecedented behavior that defied every scientific explanation. "I'll do what I can," he promised, administering emergency first aid to stabilize Luna until they could transfer her to appropriate veterinary facilities. In the chaotic hours that followed, Jack regained consciousness in the hospital. He had sustained a concussion and a fractured collarbone, but his injuries were not life-threatening. The intruders were quickly identified as hired muscle working for a shell company linked to Michael Reynolds and Eric Daniels, who were subsequently arrested in Duluth. Shockingly, Marjorie Dawson was implicated as well. She had provided insider information about the cabin's layout and Jack's routines in exchange for promised kickbacks from the mineral rights acquisition. Meanwhile, Luna remained in critical condition at a regional veterinary hospital. Staff there were astonished by her extraordinary bond with Sarah and her unnaturally calm, cooperative behavior for a wild animal. Despite all efforts, Luna's prognosis remained grim. 3 days after the attack, a somber phone call came to Jack's hospital room. The veterinarian's voice was heavy with regret. Luna had taken a sharp turn for the worse and was not expected to survive the night. When Sarah overheard the news, she became inconsolable. "She needs me," she sobbed. "She won't leave without saying goodbye." Against medical advice, Jack signed himself out of the hospital, and Sheriff Ellis drove them to the veterinary clinic. There, Luna lay unresponsive, her breathing shallow and her body cold to the touch. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," the veterinarian said gently as Sarah buried her face in Luna's cooling fur. She fought hard, but the damage was too severe. "She's not gone yet," Sarah insisted, her voice muffled against the lynx's neck. "She's waiting." Jack placed a hand on his granddaughter's small shoulder, his heart breaking all over again for the child who had already endured so much. "Sometimes, little bird," he said softly, "we have to let go, even when it hurts more than anything." But Sarah lifted her tear-streaked face and shook her head. She needs her family, like she called them before. Before anyone could stop her, Sarah had gently scooped Luna's limp body into her arms and bolted for the exit. Jack and Ellis rushed after her in alarm, stunned that the girl could carry an animal of Luna's size. "Sarah!" Jack called. "Stop!" But she didn't. Sarah ran to the edge of the woods behind the clinic, where she laid Luna gently on the earth. Then she stepped back, lifted her arms, and let out a long, high-pitched keening sound. Not words, but a call that sent chills down Jack's spine. Ellis reached instinctively for his sidearm, unsure what the distraught girl was attempting. "Jack?" "She's not thinking clearly." But Jack held up a hand, eyes narrowed, voice steady. "Wait." For long moments, nothing happened. Sarah continued to call, her voice growing hoarser, more urgent. Just as Ellis stepped forward, movement flickered at the edge of the forest. 2 reflective eyes, then more. One by one, Canada lynxes emerged from the trees like silent ghosts, the same hunting party that had defended the cabin. Their distinctive markings made them unmistakable. They approached cautiously, forming a circle around Luna's still body. The scarred male, the one Sarah had begun calling guardian, stepped forward first, sniffing at Luna's wound. "Please," Sarah whispered. "Help her, like you helped us." What happened next was beyond comprehension, a phenomenon that defied every law of nature and biology. As the wild lynxes circled around Luna, their actions were deliberate and almost ceremonial. The first to approach was Guardian, the largest and most battle-worn of the lynxes. His movements were slow and careful as he gently nudged Luna's limp body. One by one, the others followed, their eyes glowing softly in the fading light. Some licked at her wounds, their tongues rough against her fur, while others laid their bodies close to hers. It was as if they were sharing their life force with her. They pressed against her side and leaned in close, their presence more than just comforting, it was life-giving. For nearly an hour, they remained there, maintaining an eerie silence, an unspoken connection between the wild creatures and the injured lynx. Sarah, holding Luna's head in her lap, remained quiet and still, watching the ritual unfold. The lynxes showed no signs of fear. Their focus was entirely on Luna, and in that moment, they seemed to embody something greater than themselves. Jack, too, stood silently beside Sarah, his face set in deep concentration. He knew something profound was happening, but even he could not have predicted the outcome. As the last rays of sunlight faded, casting long shadows over the clearing, the lynxes began to retreat into the surrounding trees, leaving Luna behind. Guardian, however, stayed just a moment longer. He touched his nose gently to Luna's, as if offering a final gesture of protection, before he, too, vanished into the woods. It was as if the bond between them had been fulfilled, their duty completed. As the last of the lynxes melted into the woods, the air around the clearing felt heavier, charged with something unexplainable. Jack and Sarah remained still for a long moment, allowing the weight of the experience to settle in. Then, the silence was broken by the sound of footsteps. Dr. Cooper arrived, his face a mixture of skepticism and concern. He had been called by the veterinary staff, who had been alarmed by Luna's condition and the incredible scene Sarah had described. Dr. Cooper approached Luna cautiously, the events of the past hour lingering in his mind. He knelt beside her, his hands trembling slightly as he checked her vitals. When he first felt her cold skin, he had feared the worst. But as he examined her more closely, he froze in disbelief. The temperature in her body was rising, slowly but steadily. "Her core temperature is rising," he murmured, voice filled with incredulity. I can't explain this." He paused, rechecking her vitals, his expression turning from skepticism to astonishment. "Profound hypothermia can mimic death in small mammals, yes, but this kind of recovery..." He looked up at Sarah and Jack, his voice faltering. "I've never seen anything like this." Sarah sat motionless, her hand gently resting on Luna's side. She didn't speak, but her eyes never left the lynx. Slowly, Luna's breathing deepened. Her chest rose and fell with each breath, and her whiskers twitched. Then, as if she had heard the call from deep within her, Luna's golden eyes flicked open, meeting Sarah's gaze. A soft, rumbling purr escaped from her chest, the sound filling the air with an almost magical resonance. The humans stood in stunned silence, unable to believe their eyes. Dr. Cooper, his clipboard still clutched in his hand, stared at Luna in wide-eyed disbelief. She's alive," he whispered. His words were barely a breath in the stillness of the woods. The impossible had happened. The lynx had fought death itself, and now she was, miraculously, alive. The days following Luna's miraculous recovery were filled with a quiet sense of disbelief, as though the forest itself had intervened to restore the balance. Jack's cabin was filled with light and life again, though the memories of the attack lingered in the air. Spring had arrived in northern Minnesota, its arrival marked by the renewal of life after a long, harsh winter. The snow had melted from the ground, and the trees began to bud once more. The scent of pine filled the air, and the forest felt alive with the promise of new beginnings. Jack, who had always been resistant to change, finally relented and allowed some modern updates to the cabin. The solar power system provided light and warmth, and the satellite internet allowed Sarah to continue her distance learning. A two-way radio had been installed for emergencies, a necessity that Jack had resisted for years, but the events of the past weeks had changed his perspective. The criminal investigations against Michael Reynolds, Eric Daniels, and Marjorie Dawson moved swiftly. Michael and Eric were arrested in Duluth, their plan to seize Jack's land and minerals exposed for the greed-driven scheme it was. Marjorie Dawson, too, was implicated. She had provided confidential information about the cabin's layout and Jack's routines in exchange for kickbacks from the acquisition of mineral rights. Her betrayal was a devastating revelation, but it ensured that the criminals would face justice. Despite the triumph of justice, there remained a lingering sense of unease. The actions of the lynxes, their coordinated defense of the cabin and their miraculous healing of Luna, could not be explained by science. No one could truly understand what had happened, but the bond between Sarah and the wild creatures was undeniable. The reports, while avoiding mention of the supernatural elements, acknowledged the extraordinary circumstances. As the case closed, Sarah's future seemed more secure than ever, with the strange events of the past few months shaping a new chapter for her and Jack. Dr. Cooper, once a skeptic, became an unlikely advocate. He testified that Sarah's upbringing, while unconventional, had fostered resilience, self-reliance, and a deep connection to the natural world, qualities that had, without a doubt, saved both her life and Jack's. A new social worker, assigned after Dawson's arrest, proved far more understanding and respectful of their situation. Luna made a full recovery. A silvery scar beneath her spotted fur marked where the bullet had struck, but it did nothing to diminish her strength or grace. Jack built her a larger, open enclosure, but Luna came and went freely now, often disappearing into the forest for days before returning to Sarah's side. Even more astonishing were her continued visitors. The Canada lynx family that had saved them remained nearby. Guardian, the scarred male, was frequently seen perched on high rocks overlooking the clearing, watching silently, like a sentinel. "It's like we have guardians," Jack said one evening as he and Sarah sat on the porch, fireflies rising from the tall meadow grass. Luna lay stretched beside Sarah's chair, tail twitching as shadows moved at the forest's edge. Sarah nodded, fingers idly stroking Luna's head. "They understand family." Jack studied her profile, older now, stronger, and wiser than her years. The traumatized child who had arrived at his door had transformed into something extraordinary, a young soul deeply attuned to the wild, to instinct, and to something greater than herself. "We're going to be all right, aren't we, little bird?" Jack asked softly. Sarah turned to him, her face illuminated by the last light of sunset. A full, genuine smile bloomed across her face, once a rare sight, now an everyday blessing. "We always were, Grandpa. We just had to find our pack." As if in agreement, Luna stretched and purred, her golden eyes reflecting the dying light. From the forest came faint calls, wild voices rising in the twilight. Not random, not distant, but familiar. They were not alone. In this remote corner of wilderness, the boundary between human and animal hearts had blurred, giving way to something rare and enduring. A family, not by blood, but by choice, and something even deeper. Jack Reynolds wrapped an arm around his granddaughter's shoulders, and together they listened as night fell over their quiet, protected domain, watched over by golden eyes that understood more than any human ever could.